Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Coffee and Conversation with DFL 52, Saturday, May 13th. Delighted to have my good friend, actually, Ryan Winkler, on with us to talk about all things politics and mostly marijuana. But before we start marijuana and Ryan talking about your background, I just want to mention to everybody on the call, congratulations to the DFL slim majority in the state Senate late yesterday for passing the public safety bill, which includes some gun safety provisions, uh, expanded background checks, red flag law. I know there's some money for a number of programs, but those two were the two big ones. So we got one big bill done. Now it's time to address the marijuana bill. So Ryan, before we get into the substance of that, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about you? I don't know if people on the call know as much about you as I know about you.
Well, let's see. I'll work backwards. Right now, I am the chair of the campaign called Minnesota is Ready. And we are an organization pushing for cannabis legalization this legislative session. And we are based on, I think, I can't remember the number, but a set of principles that include racial equity, making sure that the cannabis market is designed to support Minnesota businesses, not create an open field for out-of-state, multi-state operators to come in and take over all the business. We need to expunge past criminal records, and when I say racial equity, I'm talking about making sure that we're creating opportunities for people and communities adversely affected by the war on drugs to participate in this marketplace and be successful or have a chance at success in this market. And there is a whole lot of stuff in this bill, but this role for me right now is a volunteer capacity. It's an issue that I care a lot about. I spent 4 years working on as majority leader. Going back to 2019, we started the Be Heard on Cannabis tour, which stopped in 15 communities across the state and really formed the backbone of the legislation we developed in 2019 and 20. Getting it through the House for the first time in 2021. In 2022, we created this low-dose hemp-derived THC market, which is popular with edibles and beverages right now, in part to try to force Republicans to come to the table on the issue. And then with DFL election victories in 2022, and I was leaving office, it was clear we had a real opportunity to get this done, get it done right, and really live up to a lot of the commitments we had made over the years to the people who'd advocated on cannabis for a long time. So anyway, 4 years in this as majority leader. Before that, I was out of office for a few years. My family and I lived in Europe, and then I'd been in the state house for 9 years prior to that, living in Golden Valley, David's old neighbor. And born and raised in Bemidji originally. And I'm a lawyer. I practice in-house for some tech companies here in Minnesota. That's kind of been my career. And for the first time in a long time, I'm not in office and I'm not pursuing office. So I don't know what comes next exactly, but I find myself in a place to have some time and think about it and try to get across the line a number of issues that I've carried paid family medical leave in the past. That's going to become law this year. I've carried the cannabis bill. It's going to become law. I carried driver's license for all. It is already the law. There's a long list of stuff that we've worked on for many years, and this is finally the time it's being pushed over the line. And so I'm helping oversee some of that work, mostly just as an interested citizen.
And you did not mention your credential as a Harvard undergraduate.
Well, yes. And it's in fact my 25th college reunion this year, which is kind of an interesting time as I find myself at a bit of not exactly a crossroads, but, at least a pause in what I've been doing and figuring out what comes next. And then going back after 25 years and having a chance to reassess. It's kind of, plus my oldest is heading off to the Naval Academy in June.
Congratulations.
So lots of, kind of time to see how things are and where they're going to go for me right now.
There's at least one person on this call who finds a Harvard credential ignominious. What is it about marijuana legislation that is such an important issue to you?
Well, it really started um, as a political problem. As majority leader or a speaker, you have to kind of keep the team together, and you have to advance the DFL cause as far as you can with the uh, opportunities that you have and the skills and people you have. Cannabis was a political problem because of the two major political parties. And they had received enough votes in the 2018 election that could have switched the majority. So it became pretty clear to me that the DFL had to have a leadership role on cannabis in order to, and really show progress and have the people involved in those parties feel like their success would be best served by working with Democrats. That could have been done by any number of people in our caucus, but the problem was that it is a very complicated set of policies. The politics and community engagement that you have to do this right, to bring people along and feel invested, it takes a lot of resources. And I was one of the few people in my office who had the team who could actually do this and do it right. So it was a problem. It had to be done well. And then along the way, once you start diving into compare arrest percentages for people of color versus white Minnesotans, despite the fact that they use cannabis at the same rates. You look at how widely available it is in schools right now or to young people. There was just nothing about the existing laws that were serving any of the goals that we have. Prohibition of cannabis had failed, and it had more consequences for people of color than we would have if we hadn't prohibited it. So it became pretty clear, not only was it a political problem, but as I dove into the issue more and understood it better, I thought it really was a policy and political imperative for Democrats, and I think it's exactly aligned with the kind of changes we have been pushing to make in our state as DFL leaders for a long time. So for me, it started with a practical need, and it became very much a cause the more I learned about it and invested myself in it.
Well, funny you should mention it being a long-term proposition. Back in the mid to late 70s, there was a group at the University of Minnesota called the Office of Alcohol and Other Drug Abuse Programming, AODAP, which had its office on University Avenue in the television screen building. And I know this because I worked for AODAP while I was still in law school. And it was during that time period that possession of a small amount of marijuana was downgraded to a petty misdemeanor. And so the efforts to legalize marijuana go back almost 50 years, if not longer. So
Yeah.
it's been around as an issue for a long time. But you do raise an interesting question in what you said, as in terms of political parties. We have two major political parties that are marijuana parties. What's going to happen to them when this bill passes? Their raison d'etre goes bye-bye.
Well, the party still exists. There are two things or three things that could happen. Number one, they could just continue on and potentially be spoilers in elections because the people who are involved in them aren't happy with this legislation enough, or they want to keep pressure on to keep these the cannabis laws, more to their liking. So that's one option. Option two would be, because it's legalized, nobody bothers to vote for those third parties anymore, and they basically wither in the next election and don't qualify as two elections, and they don't qualify for major party status anymore. And then the third option, and I know there is legislation on this, is to retroactively or maybe prospectively change the threshold for being a major party, so that you can't do it with 5%. You need to hit something like 7, 8 to 10. And I know that that Jamie Long, the person who's now the majority leader, has been working on that issue. But I frankly have not tracked carefully this session how the progress on that legislation is going. There are Democrats opposed on the principle of open democracy.
I was going to ask you if you have a crystal ball on that issue. Do you know where it's headed, or No.
No, I could probably find out if I sent a text at the beginning of this conversation. I might have an answer for you at the end.
It's hardly critical, but I know that candidates who faced third-party challenges, most notably Angie Craig over the last two cycles, would love to see those parties either fold or fold into the party that supports marijuana legislation.
Yeah, exactly. So definitely that's a question that DFL leadership people are trying to figure out right now.
I do want to remind everybody, if you have questions, this is after all, a coffee and conversation. Let's make it a conversation. Raise your electronic hand if you would. If you can't find the electronic hand under, I think it's under reactions. You can raise your physical hand and wave a little bit. But let's have a conversation about this. Ryan, as we get into the discussion about the legislation, why don't you tell us what the current status of marijuana law is, and please include in that you mentioned CBD and edibles and all the rest. Fold all of that in to your answer, if you would.
Okay, well, I'll start at the top. Cannabis at the federal level is a controlled Schedule I controlled substance. That has not changed in a long time. It puts cannabis in the most dangerous and addictive drugs. That's what Schedule I is, with the least potential benefit under federal law. Cannabis in that, okay, so that's controlled substance. Cannabis that is less than 0.3% THC. So THC, delta-9 THC, is the psychoactive molecule that creates the high that people experience from cannabis. So if you have a cannabis plant that has less than 0.3% THC in it, it is considered hemp by the federal government. It is not considered marijuana, a controlled substance. It's an agricultural commodity at that level. That change happened in the 2018 Farm Bill. And what has happened since 2018 is there's been an explosion of CBD products, which are derived from hemp. The hemp manufacturers, let's just say that loosely, have made CBD products. They have also developed processes for concentrating the delta-9 THC that is one of the cannabinoids, so that you can, from hemp, you can create delta-9 THC. You can also create lots of other cannabinoids like delta-8 or delta-10, and there's a profusion of these cannabinoids on the market derived from hemp, basically because a lot of people have taken the position that these products are not specifically prohibited by the federal government, so therefore they must be legal under the hemp laws, even though their capacity to make you high and potentially very untested, some of them synthetic products that have no real history of testing or use, it creates a lot of potential danger. So under federal law, the same plant, basically hemp versus cannabis, or we'll say hemp versus marijuana, just to make it clearer. So hemp versus marijuana. Hemp is an agricultural commodity. It is, you're free to move it through interstate commerce. The FDA has not regulated it, even though these are products that are consumed by people. And the FDA, in fact, has refused to regulate it and told Congress they will not regulate it unless they're forced to by an act of Congress. So what we did last year for hemp-based delta-9 THC products is say that as long as it's less than 0.3% and up to 5 milligrams per serving, you can sell food and beverage with hemp-based delta-9 THC in it. That is what all the microbreweries have started to basically market. And it's kind of been a big boost and kind of an explosion of interest in these beverages and gummies since. And those products, because they're legal at the state level, they have some regulation at the state level, and they're legal at the federal level. They are, the only kind of cloud on them is that the FDA has not and will not regulate them. Then on
So
the
you meant go ahead. Go ahead.
okay, and so then you go switch to the marijuana side. Again, controlled substance under federal law. I think 23 states. I think maybe Minnesota would be the 23rd or 24th state to allow marijuana to be grown and sold in a intra-state marketplace. And so there have been a lot of different ways of doing it. We can dive into the bill and the details, but essentially Minnesota would be yet another state that is choosing to legalize it at the state level. But those products remain illegal under federal law, and that creates a lot of challenges in the banking, insurance, and tax realm, as well as essentially eliminating any kind of interstate commerce in these products, at least in a legal regulated market. So it's a bit of a weird environment to operate in. And right now in Minnesota, marijuana is illegal. Yes, we have essentially decriminalized a very small amount of possession, but that doesn't change the fact that there are disproportionate arrests, and marijuana is used as a basis for searching people and searching cars, because if you smell it, it's David could explain this better than I could, but if you can use it, basically the smell of it, as a basis for a search that you would not otherwise be able to have cause to conduct. So there are still significant issues with it, and of course these laws are not really being enforced very much anyway. You don't have to just spend time out around the public places. You smell marijuana in far more frequently than you ever did before, because essentially the population has moved on and law enforcement is only going to do so much at this point. So in my mind, it's technically illegal right now. The support for keeping it illegal is gone, and society is essentially moving on regardless of what the laws say. And so in some ways you could see our cannabis legalization bill as updating the laws to reflect what society is doing anyway.
Well, marijuana is a Schedule I drug, as you mentioned, and that scheduling is done by what, the FDA or the DEA?
I think it is done by, that's a good question. I don't know how much discretion an agency has, because I think it's actually, I think it's an interplay. I think that Congress actually creates the schedule. I think that some of those drugs have been put there by Congress, but I think that for purposes of regulatory purposes, these, whether, I can't remember, it would be the FDA or the DEA or both, could deschedule it for their regulatory purposes, even though under law formally it's Schedule I.
Right. And so you kind of beg the question I want to ask, which is, if the scheduling is an administrative phenomenon, that falls under the purview and authority of the executive branch, i.e. the president, who could theoretically issue an executive order changing the scheduling of marijuana. Yes, no?
I think directionally you're correct.
So why don't they do that?
It's been one of the things that has been under consideration in the Biden administration.
Okay.
But
On the flip side,
I don't know enough about the details. It could be that there are questions of authority and litigation, such as when the president eliminate the student loan forgiveness.
right.
It's before the Supreme Court now. The question is, if you're going to be challenged and your authority is questionable, is it worth making the announcement and doing it and tying it up forever?
Sure.
That may be the consideration.
All right. And Curtis, I saw your hand up, but I want to pop one more question in first, Ryan, and that's this. If the authority to change the schedule rests with Congress, isn't there a federal preemption problem that will make all the state laws moot, irrelevant, and void?
If that federal preemption were ever to be enforced, yes. But it's essentially a wink and a nod from the Department of Justice saying they're not going to enforce federal law on cannabis in states that have legalized it.
All right. In other words, it's a mess.
Yeah, I think at least
Yeah.
from a legal standpoint, it is a bit of a mess. The states that have legalized already are starting to see a lot of consolidation in the cannabis industry, in part. But one of the biggest issues is you can't deduct your business expenses from your taxes if you are running a marijuana company, and that's a huge, that's a huge part of any money that you might make in the business.
Right. And the one time I went into a CBD shop, I had to pay cash because they could not put any deposits into a bank that would identify it as a CBD shop. So you mentioned the banking issue before. That's still a big problem, isn't it?
Not as much. You can't use Visa or MasterCard credit transactions, but most states have banks that are willing to basically do a merchant like debit type account at those kinds of banks, and there are workarounds.
And I would imagine that a state chartered bank would not have the same problems as a federally chartered bank.
Yeah, that's true. I've been Bridgewater Bank, which I don't know, has a number of branches around the Twin Cities. I met with them. They are a state chartered bank, not federally. They only have locations in Minnesota. So their only two regulators are the FDIC and the State Department of Commerce. The State Department of Commerce won't have a problem with them taking or doing business with cannabis if it's legal under state law. And when they talked to the FDIC essentially said, we don't care about this problem. Like, we're not enforcing this anymore as long as you show us that you have a decent program in place to only take in clients who are legitimate and above board. So if you have a reasonable due diligence process in place, the FDI doesn't care if a state-based bank transacts business in this sector.
Okay. Curtis, you had your hand up, but you've taken it down. Do you still have a question?
Nope.
Okay. Ryan, we have a couple of our Egan City Council members on the call with us, Mike Sapina and Gary Hansen. One of the issues in the conference committee is local control, as I understand it. Let's have a little dialogue amongst the three of you about what is the issue on local control in the conference committee, and where does Egan stand on regulating marijuana? What is it that they'd like to do? Ryan, why don't you go first?
Well, so I'll just, as a general principle, one of the things that we did in crafting this legislation was to study what had worked and not worked in other states, and to talk with people who were working in states where they've had this in place for some time. One of the challenges, for example, in the state of Colorado, is that each county could decide whether to participate in the cannabis program or not. And the experience there, there's still a significant illicit marketplace for cannabis, in part because there is different local units of government have chosen to do things differently. And so there are substantial illegal grow operations in counties where it's not legal to sell it in a regulated marketplace. And then there's an export issue to other states, which is another reason why there's some significant illegal market, cannabis activity. But pretty consistently, we have seen and learned and talked to people from other states who have cautioned against local opt-outs because it is guaranteed that the illicit marketplace will continue if significant parts of the state have local units of government who decide that they can't have dispensaries or manufacturing operations in their cities or in their counties. So for the broad principle or goal of shifting an illicit marketplace into a legal marketplace, we didn't want a patchwork of local regulations. And we also wanted to keep taxes relatively low and the regulations relatively manageable, because states that have complicated systems or a patchwork of systems or very high taxes tend to have very large illegal marketplaces continuing on even after legalization has happened. So that's kind of where we are. There are a number of issues related to local control, but at its core, the idea of local units of government deciding not to allow the market to be legal in their jurisdiction was not something we wanted to do. There have been a lot of compromises on other issues, and those are still continuing on.
Gary and Mike, why don't one of you guys or both of you weigh in? And what's Egan doing on this subject?
wondering
And
if
do you
I
agree or
should-
disagree?
Should I weigh in first just because I'm the less experienced one, and then Gary can go in and correct everything I say? So I don't know, I've only been in for a little more than 2 years, Ryan's, but what I've kind of learned from since I've been on the council is that we do in Egan have kind of a tradition of not kind of overstepping our local, what we do locally. So we did have a discussion last year about I don't know, I guess the terminology I would use would be a cluster of that gummy law and how it kind of passed, and it was a little bit confusing, and we talked amongst ourselves and said, what should we be doing, if anything, about this? And we decided we would just kind of hold back and let the state legislature take care of it, which it appears that they are going to, which is great. So yeah, it's as far as local, some cities look at it differently, but we typically try and concentrate on, more hyper local kind of things and not get too involved in larger statewide issues. So I'll mute and let Gary kind of follow on from there.
Well, Mike has learned quickly in those 2 years. He is correct. We've had brief discussions about this. There's no indication that any of our council members have any desire to opt out, certainly. And as Mike said, what we would do is, we don't see the necessity to establish any local level of regulation. We would defer to the state and also cooperate with the county as required. So we don't intend to do anything in terms of placing any additional restrictions in the city of Egan in this area. And in fact, I've had questions from some residents about this, looking for some guidance in this area and what can they expect from us. And that's been the response. We're going to defer to state legislation and regulation.
And I do see someone commented in the chat. I mean, there's always going to be zoning issues as far as this, just like there is with liquor and
Correct.
other products and businesses, and that will of course come into play. But that's kind of different than regulating, the whole industry.
Yeah, and to David's point, and what there is a bit of a balance. So we did not want to do a full opt out, but we are allowing, for example, we created a system where you're licensed. For example, a dispensary is licensed at the state level. It will then be issued a local license, not for any additional money and not for a separate application, but you'll receive a local license, which then the local unit of government can enforce the terms of. So if a dispensary is violating the law or selling underage or something like that, local units of government will have the authority to investigate and enforce like they do for liquor or cigarettes. And then that license can either be pulled or there can be an objection to the license holder issued with the state. So there is a bit of a dual role. The tax rate, I think, is going to be 10%. 2% of that, or 2 of that 10 will go to local units of government to help offset costs. And local units of government do have their usual time, place, and manner zoning authority to limit where dispensaries or manufacturers can be, so long as the zoning rules don't create essentially rules that allow no dispensaries to be there. So, and then finally, we have a geographic or a population concentration rule. I don't know what the number is going to be yet. That's still being worked out in the conference committee, but essentially something like you can't have more than one dispensary for every 10,000 people, for more than one for every 10,000 people or something like that, depending on the city that you're in.
Curtis, your hand's up. You're still muted.
There are some questions in the chat. I think people are looking for more information about the specifics about zoning and what will be allowed and what won't be allowed and what cities can do and can't do. Do you have any more on that?
Well, so I think the news coming out of the conference committee, which is not public yet, is, for example, a city can say that you can't have a dispensary within 1,000 feet of a park, but they define that to be 1,000 feet of the center of the park, not the edge of a park. So a city would be allowed to have that kind of limitation. And as I mentioned, there will be a state limitation on the number of dispensaries based on population. But again, those numbers are not something I've seen. That's still being worked out. Let's just say that. I don't know exactly where it is this morning. I would guess sometime next week we will know. But otherwise, if a city wants to, require certain kinds of signage or certain kinds of, zoning categories for these businesses to be in, or, limits on times of day and that kind of thing, as long as it's, general zoning kinds of rules, the cities can regulate them. That was one of the things we learned from Colorado, which is the city like Boulder knew it was coming. They knew it was going to be popular locally. And so they really worked to make sure that their ordinance and regulations were done well ahead of time. And they didn't end up with all these, head shop looking places and these big loud, green signs and all this kind of stuff. They basically said their dispensaries looked like an insurance agency if you were driving down the street, because they wanted it, but they wanted it to be done a certain way.
John Wells.
Yeah, I'm just wondering on the consumption side, what kind of regulations are envisioned for how old kids have to be before they can smoke and all that?
It's 21 plus, and public consumption is not allowed in the same way you can't legally walk down the street drinking a bottle of beer. You won't be able to legally walk down the street smoking a joint. How those are enforced will be very much a local decision, I suspect. But generally, in terms of consumption, it's 21 plus. The Clean Indoor Air Act applies. So just like you can't smoke tobacco in a lot of places, you won't be able to smoke weed in a lot of places either.
Yeah, the reason I ask is I did a lot of weed my sophomore year at college at Madison, Wisconsin. And my grade point went from an A- to a C because I lost motivation. I mean, it was, obviously it was illegal back then and it didn't stop us. And I just decided after a while that this is not a good course for me to be on. But there is a downside for that. It's not unlike becoming an alcoholic, I think. But I don't know how this set of laws is likely to affect that. Probably very little, since those kids will still be illegal, but they'll still find a way to get it.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's sort of like the question isn't whether cannabis should exist in our society or it shouldn't. The question is what laws will best manage the harms and not create other harms. So yes, there are downsides to especially excessive cannabis consumption or cannabis consumption for younger people with developing brains. I mean, there are real issues, but right now surveys indicate that 6 to 7 out of 10 students in middle school say it's easy or very easy to get it. And in fact, what has happened in Colorado in particular, I know I can't not up on other states' more recent experience, but in Colorado, they saw a modest decline in youth use of cannabis after legalization.
Okay, thanks.
Well, John, I don't know what happened to you, John, but my grade point went up in college after I started to smoke.
You probably were dealing with anxiety or something.
I must have been. Carl Forsberg, you had a question in the chat that sounded pretty important. Would you ask it, please?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
No, my question is, I don't know, how does the 10% tax rate compare with other states? And is it low enough to discourage an underground market as in California?
So 10% is the lowest any state has. There are a few other states that are at 10%. The bill started at 8, and the 2% or the 2 points that went on top of it were essentially at the request of counties and cities who wanted resources to manage the new legislation, I guess. So I wish it had stayed at 8. I don't, 10 is still at the lowest that any state has. And that's on top of the sales tax. Another important factor here is we're not taxing it at the producer level or the grower level. It's only at point of sale. So there's no excise tax, like, for example, you see in alcohol. So it will be among the lowest, or the lowest, but I honestly wish it had been even a bit lower, because I think that would have resulted in a better policy outcome.
Yeah, well, that's encouraging, because my concern is not so much, illegal use and traffic and all that stuff, is the idea that it's a criminal market, and we're in effect encouraging that by keeping it illegal. So, but I'm glad we're not looking at pricing it so high that we still preserve that market, which is not desirable.
Exactly. And we very clearly chose not to try to think of this as a moneymaker for the state or for local government. The goal has only been for this product to pay for itself.
Cheryl Casey, your hands up. You're still on mute, Cheryl.
I'm trying.
There you
Okay,
go.
sorry about that. I'm off mute now. My question is, do you have model ordinances for cities? I think that, they're all going to be faced with coming up with ordinances after this law is passed. And I'm wondering what you're recommending, and if there's some localities that you recommend that we get ordinances from in other states.
Yeah, so we started talking to the League of Cities and the Association of Counties in 2019. So that conversation has been going on for 4 years. We have talked about model ordinances along the way, but typically they would be the ones developing those sorts of products for local units of government to use. So I don't really know that much about where that sits right now. But I do know that it won't be because we haven't engaged them early enough on this conversation.
Okay. So you recommend, like we've got a couple of city council people here. The city council folks, have you looked into that already?
If I could answer that, both Mike and I are on League of Minnesota Cities policy committees, and I think the appropriate committees will be talking about the issue of some guidance for the ordinances that we do develop. So we'll have that policy discussion and hope to get some guidance to come out of that.
And it's just kind of related question. It'll be roughly 18 months after the legislation passes before we would expect dispensaries to be open. So there is some time for cities to figure out what they want to do.
Is there a way for citizens to get involved?
That's a question for Gary.
Yeah, and any ordinance that would be drafted and proposed by our city attorney, there would be the opportunity to comment on that, yes.
Got an advisory committee or commission. You have plenty of those.
Just to throw in, we do little used, but we do have a listening session before every single city council meeting for a half hour. Don't often have people that show up, but it's for anything that's not on the agenda. So actually right now, there isn't any of this on the agenda because we don't have a law out of the legislature yet. So maybe a good time to come in and get your ideas in front of the council. It's kind of an informal discussion, but it might be a good time to do that before we're actually faced with, coming up with our local law on it.
Vijayesh, you have a question.
There's also, I just want to jump in on this issue.
Oh, sure.
But there's also an option for cities to operate a municipal dispensary the same way, similar to a municipal liquor store.
Which Egan will not be doing.
Vijayesh.
Yeah, to John Wells' comment, I know lots of people who actually do much better, have done much better in college and higher education after taking a joint or something. So maybe it's just your situation at that time. But my question for
BGS, they just think they're doing better.
oh no, the results show that. You know,
Okay,
you have objective results. So I think I'm with Ron on this one. So, which doesn't mean that, you know, you have to, it's a personal choice. But one question for Ryan is what about, like, you know, we are talking about commercial dispensaries and things like that. What about people who would like to grow something, you know, themselves as a little, like in your backyard or, you know, in your farm or something like that for your personal consumption? Or are they compelled to buy this stuff from the commercial establishment?
We are allowing what is called home grow, and that would be up to 8 plants, any 4 of which could be flowering at one time. And then you can hold on to, and I think I can't remember I don't actually know where the number is going to come out, but it has been anywhere from 2.5 to 10 pounds of cannabis you can maintain for your personal use.
And
I had a
you know, there
garden
was
in my,
this,
go ahead, Vijayesh.
no, see, right now, you even before this legislation, you could get a license, I believe. I don't know if it's called a license or a permit for personal consumption for people who feel they need it for their, you know, whatever they have or whatever ailments they have. What happens to that provision? You still have that for the medical marijuana, or it sort of goes away, or?
Yeah, I saw that question pop up in the chat too. The medical program will continue. It will transition over to the Office of Medical Cannabis, or Office of Cannabis Management, sorry, OCM, which will be basically like a state agency. And the issue of it's a big question of how licenses are going to be issued and what the restrictions are for the amount of cannabis you can grow and sell based on the kind of business you are. So we have 2 existing medical companies. The limits in our program have made it quite expensive and inaccessible to people. And so we're trying to keep the medical market alive and expand it while simultaneously having it, you know, in a way compete with the adult use marketplace. The advantages of the medical program are, first of all, there are no taxes on the product if you go through the medical program. And number 2, people have the benefit of having a physician and then people and a pharmacist help advise on dosing and the right kind of products to have and use and so forth. But it will continue.
On the
And
subject
one
of
final thing, Ron.
homegrown, I had a single plant in my garden in Northeast Minneapolis about 40 years ago, and it drove my mother-in-law crazy. She was just afraid the police were going to drive up the alley and see my plant and raid the house and do all those terrible things. So I'm glad to know that I'm finally becoming legal.
I'm glad
Vijayesh?
to see that Ron and John and all were quite adventurous in their youth. So it's kind of interesting. But one last
it's a
thing
prerequisite to leadership in DFL 51 and 2.
Exactly.
That's right.
I fully endorse that. Yeah. But one last question before I give it back to Ron to move this forward. The spirit behind this, is it treating the legislation, does it treat cannabis more like alcohol, or does it treat it more like cigarettes, both of which, you know, are addictive? Actually, they are both of which are more addictive than cannabis, I believe. What is the, like, for instance, will there be restaurants or bars or special places where people can go and have a joint, or whatever they do with cannabis? Or is it only for in their own homes that they can have this?
No, there is some provision for licenses for on-site consumption as well as for events. And how all of that plays out is a little bit up in the air, but there will be places where you, like sort of a lounge that you can go to. I mean, there are going to be issues about clean indoor air, you know, for that kind of thing. But for the most part, theoretically, you shouldn't see a lot of difference. People are really mostly expected to consume privately, but whether they do or not is probably going to be mostly a question of enforcement.
Right. But my point was exactly that. Will there be like dedicated areas in, you know, restaurants or bars or whatever,
Oh,
and where
no, no.
like you have in other places, you can, you know, so, okay, thank you. And Ron, it's back to you.
Thank you, Vijesh. Lisa, you have your hand up. Lisa Rogers.
Thank you. I have a couple quick questions regarding like the interim time between, you said it was 18 months before dispensaries would be up and running, but the law gets passed prior to that. So would home grow then be effective when the law gets passed, even before the dispensaries are open? And as far as like possession and enforcement, would that also be like after the law gets passed, will that take effect before the dispensaries open?
Those questions are a little bit still up in the air and being discussed by the conference committee, working out the differences between the House and Senate. Specifically on home grow, yes, it will be legal before dispensaries are open. I don't remember exactly the effective date for that is kind of up in the air, but my assumption is it'll be sometime this summer where home grow will be legal. You have to be careful about that and limit it because what has happened in New York, for example, is that the effort to create a social equity program in the license system, I think, went too far constitutionally. There have been a lot of legal challenges. The whole system has been held up, and people have been essentially illegally selling lots of cannabis throughout New York City. And if you open the door with a home grow program without restrictions on passing it around to neighbors and so on, you could end up with a lot of people just trying to make as much money as they can quickly before the laws are rolled out. So I don't know where they're going to finally come down on that. Your possession and penalties question, it fits to that exactly. The transitional period has to be managed pretty well to not end up in a lot of chaos. And so I don't know exactly how they're going to come out on that, but the goal is to make those things effective before 18 months.
Thank you. And then I have just two quick questions now regarding the taxation. I know that some states kind of designate the taxation on their marijuana sales, or at least that was my understanding, for certain buckets or things like education or law enforcement. Do you know if Minnesota is planning to designate the taxes, or is it just going to go into the general pot?
As of now, it will go into the general fund, but there are a lot of appropriations in the bill that are related to substance use disorder, supporting more training for drug recognition experts and law enforcement to help deal with the roadway safety issues, and funding for education on cannabis and public health education and so on. So there are a lot of appropriations in the bill that are intended to go on an ongoing basis, but I think the revenue will just go into the general fund.
Excellent. And my final question is regarding the medical program. I know that Minnesota has one of the most restrictive medical programs where we only have certain things that people can get marijuana prescriptions for. You have to kind of fall into certain criteria. So once it's legalized for recreational, is the medical program going to kind of ease the restrictions, or are they going to have the same restrictions that they currently have?
It's a very good question, which is what people say when they don't have the perfect answer in their head right away. So we have been loosening those restrictions up over time through legislation, and the Office of Medical Cannabis has been expanding the categories of diseases or conditions that you need to have in order to be able to access the medical program. I think my memory is that all of those decisions will in the future be made by the Office of Cannabis Management, so that you don't have to have the state legislature saying whether intractable pain and cancer are the same thing or not. It'll be much more of a rulemaking process, a regulatory process. But expect that it will continue to expand what, the availability will continue to expand, and also more providers will come into the market. And I think costs will come down. Because the other side of it is when adult use rec becomes legal and products are more affordable than in the market or in the medical side has to adjust.
I'd like to go back to the municipalities question for a second. There are a couple of things, loose ends that are still out there for me. One is the municipal liquor store. There are some communities that have municipal liquor stores. If I understand correctly, they have a monopoly in their communities. Will that apply to cannabis if the municipal liquor stores decide to sell? And then perhaps implicit in that statement in question is another one, and that is, can liquor stores sell cannabis products? Can they sell, for example, even today, the CBD beverages? Is there any provision in the legislation addressing distribution of beverages in and through liquor stores?
So the second part, yes, liquor stores will be able to sell CBD or Delta-9 THC derived from hemp beverages and gummies. The reason they were excluded under the law last year is because of a weird quirk in Minnesota law, which we did not anticipate, which is that there's a list of things in statute that a liquor store can sell. And if it's not on the list, a liquor store can't sell it. And nobody added these products to that list last year, but that has been done this year. And in terms of the monopoly, the legislation is silent on that. It would be up to the Office of Cannabis Management to issue regulations or rules about how that would work.
Okay, and how about grocery stores? Trader Joe's, Byerly's, they have grocery stores, and right next door, through a separate entrance, they have liquor stores. Will grocery stores be able to sell CBD products in the store, or will they have to open up a separate entranceway to do it?
No, they can. If it's hemp based, they'll be able to sell it. They have to have 21 plus age verification. There's a provision that requires gummies to be sold behind counters or kept behind counters and sold that way. And in terms of like the adult use recreational market, I don't think liquor stores, well, first of all, none of those businesses will want to sell the full recreational cannabis product, because doing so will basically infect all of their regular business with the restrictions in federal law on taxes and banking and insurance and so on. So they will not run them through the same operations. It might be an owner of a liquor store through another company in a totally different manner opens up a dispensary, but it won't be connected to any existing liquor licenses of any kind.
So if I'm Total Wine, I'm probably not going to want to have a CBD beverage section, even though I could have.
Well, they could have a CBD beverage section, but they would not want a marijuana beverage section.
Okay.
Mike, your job is going to become what wines are best paired with what levels
Yeah,
of
right.
THC.
You got that right. But the last part of my municipality question is, are there some cities, unlike Egan, which is willing to defer to the state, are there some cities that really do want to have local control? And in particular, I wonder about Minneapolis, St. Paul, Duluth, and Rochester.
I think you would generally say there are some cities who like local control more than others across the board as a philosophical or principled matter. And there are some cities who just don't like this change and they will do anything to try to slow it down or stop it. So I think it's a mix, but I have not heard much. Let's just put it this way. This policy is so popular in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Duluth that I don't think their local officials want to do anything other than help support this bill get passed. I don't think they're going to fight over local control very much.
Okay, so you're in conference committee. Cheryl, by the way, you had your hand up before. Did that question get answered?
I think it did. I was curious why you wouldn't sell cannabis products at a liquor store. It seems like the business goes hand in hand.
The issue is just federal law. So if you're selling a federally controlled substance in your liquor store, all the proceeds from the sale of that illegal substance get mixed in with your revenue from all of the rest of your business, and it puts in jeopardy the way that all that your legal money is treated as it's coming in.
So
Got
it's taxation.
Pardon?
You said something about taxation
Yeah.
before that you can't deduct your business expenses, so
Right.
it's a taxation issue. Or
And
regulatory.
banking and insurance, you could easily lose your insurance from most carriers if you were carrying these products and selling them in the same locations.
Thank you.
John Wells, you just posted a question in the chat. I didn't understand it. Would you kindly repeat it?
Well, yeah, and the reason is I can't think of the name of what are those electronic devices that kids smoke with? And
Vaping?
vaping, is there any regulation to for THC consumption through vaping is what I was trying to ask. Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah, it's treated the same as other kinds of inhalation, smoking, vaping is treated the same way.
Okay, thanks.
So we're down to a conference committee. The conference committee met yesterday for what seemed to be about an hour. They passed a couple of what seemed to me to be minor agreements on disputed issues. I think they might have been technical language issues, and then they recessed. What's going on with the conference committee, and are they in fact going to get it all done by the end of the session, which is coming up mighty fast?
Yeah, they have been meeting. Basically, Representative Stevenson and Senator Port and their staffs have been meeting kind of endlessly to try to hammer out the details of the legislation. And as they finish off sections and get the language drafted, then they post it and get reactions, and then they will adopt it. And yes, it will be done probably. I mean, there's a decent chance the legislature wraps up by next Friday, 4 days early or 3 days early.
Wow, that's a first.
First, for sure.
Yeah, haven't heard that in a long time.
I'm not saying it's going to happen. I would still bet against it, but it's the best chance I have seen so far of it actually happening.
Okay, well, we've hit an hour. Are there other questions that are lingering out there that people want to ask?
Hey, Ron, there's one in the chat. I think
Yeah,
it showed up twice about the age. I'd be curious to hear what Ryan has to say about that.
Yeah, I don't disagree on the science. The science would say the same thing about alcohol, tobacco, and military service, and probably like decision making and voting. But for whatever reason, we as a society have essentially adopted 21 as a standard, and there's just not. I don't think it's practical to limit this purchase to people 25 and older.
Lisa, you had your hand up? No?
Yeah, I did, but I think we kind of already talked about it. I was just wondering about movement at the federal level to remove marijuana as a Schedule 1. And I think we discussed that earlier regarding.
Yeah,
how
I think we did.
Thank you.
Still not.
60 votes to defeat the filibuster. I would not count on it anytime soon.
Yeah, how about that? John?
Just the comment that when we talk about medical marijuana, we talk about, well, intense pain or cancer or whatever. What about plain old depression? Why do we ignore that as a medical use?
I am not a mental health expert. I think that in the future, I can see physicians recommending cannabis for anxiety, which is, sleeplessness and all that kind of thing. But people are kind of experimenting with that a bit on their own. In terms of depression, I'm not sure depression and cannabis are the best match, but I don't really know.
Yeah, I don't know either, but it's just we tend to deal with the physical illnesses and not the non-physical ones. And by the way, I would rather not smoke because I can't stand the thought of inhaling smoke. I grew up in a family where my dad smoked in the car and he opened those little triangle vents. They didn't do a damn thing, and I hated smoke, so I never really smoked cigarettes. it was easy to smoke grass because it was less concentrated, I think. I couldn't inhale cigarettes. I would cough, but I don't want to do any of the above today, but I'd be tempted to do the medical part, but it would have to be accessible. And I'm assuming it's more concentrated than the stuff you can buy currently over the counter, but that's, yeah.
It could be more concentrated. Under the law, you'll be able to buy up to 10 milligrams in a can of a hemp-derived Delta-9 THC beverage.
Okay.
I was
Jim Johnson asked whether
Thank-
the 8 plant limit is per person or per household.
Well, that's a good question. I think it's per household, but I'm not entirely sure.
That would be my guess. It'd be really hard to enforce if you're driving by the alley and you see some plants in the garden and you count 16, you got to go knock on the door and find out how many people are in that household. That would be a pretty difficult enforcement proposition.
A family of 5 having 40 plants would be
Yeah, that'd be a problem. Anyway, Ryan, thank you so much for carving out some time for us. This has been really fun. I'm delighted with all of the exchange that we had this morning. A very active group today, and that's great. Are you satisfied with what you perceive to be the likely outcome? You and your group satisfied with the outcome?
Mostly. I mean, there's always things we would quibble with and would hope to be better. And there's some unknowns still, but right now it looks pretty good.
Good. Glad to hear that.
Is the 8 plant limit based on 2 south-facing windows?
You're sounding like a lawyer, John. What's up with
I don't
you?
know what got into me, but
The real
Oh, my
question is,
goodness.
how do you get seeds? Because you technically can't ship those across state lines. So, but nobody,
Well,
nobody ever does it, I'm sure.
all you need is one plant to surreptitiously cross the border, and then you've got a source.
There you go.
For everybody who's still on the call, remember we've got a cleanup this afternoon at a community cleanup at 2 o'clock. I don't recall exactly where people are meeting. Curtis, maybe you know that offhand?
I can look it up real quick.
Okay. Next month, we haven't nailed down what we're doing yet, but I'm working with folks at Moms Demand Action to have a representative from Moms to come talk about gun safety legislation and where that ended up in the state legislature, and obviously a very hot and sadly timely topic. Steve Simon has agreed to come on. We're working to schedule a date with him. I know that T. McClenty is working on getting Common Cause to come visit with us to talk about ranked choice voting, which will probably be an issue that's quieted down by the time we reach them. Cheryl Casey wants us to reach out to Governor Ernie Carlson. We haven't started that yet, Cheryl, but we certainly will do that to see if Governor Carlson wants to come join us. So we've got a number of really hot topics coming in the future. Ryan, you're welcome to join us anytime you like and participate, or just sit in the background and watch us do whatever we do.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks for having me this morning. I appreciate the time to chat and reconnect with some of you.
thanks, Ryan.
It's been really fun. Curtis, you're the ranking member of DFL 52 on the call since Lisa signed off. Is anything from the officers bench want to
I
mention?
was just gonna say, adopt a street, we're meeting at Target at 2 p.m. The Target on Cliff Road. So yeah, if you want to stop by, that'd be great. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks, everybody. Happy Saturday. Go plant your gardens. And I don't think we can plant our marijuana plants yet, but maybe next year. We'll see you all soon.
See ya.
Bye.